This lesson provides a review of using Active Directory domain services in Windows Azure. Primarily, I'm going to focus on the Windows Azure Infrastructure as a Service, which is basically virtual machines hosted in the Windows Azure public cloud. Now, when we talk about Active Directory in Windows Azure, we're not talking about the Windows Azure Active Directory service, which is more of an identity service available in Windows Azure that is leveraged by products such as Office 365, but could also be your custom applications. What I'm talking about is focused on using traditional Active Directory domain services that could be hosted on-premise or even extended into Windows Azure by services running inside Windows Azure Infrastructure as a Service virtual machines. Then when we think about this, there's actually many types of service you may run in virtual machines in Windows Azure that actually require domain membership to function, which means I have to be able to talk to Active Directory. AD membership requires a number of things. I have to be able to find my domain controllers. This means I have to have DNS name resolution functioning. So I have to be able to talk to DNS servers that host Active Directory records, typically domain controllers themselves, and I have to be able to then communicate with the domain controllers. So name resolution and IP connectivity to the domain controllers. I also need the ability to ascertain which is the correct domain controller to communicate with, which means site definitions within Active Directory. So before DNS can function, I have to have communication between my virtual machines running in Windows Azure and, initially at least, my on-premise infrastructure where my domain controllers would live. Now, there are a number of different types of connectivity which are really beyond the scope of this training. However, I recently wrote an article where I talk about a new express route functionality available in Windows Azure. But initially, I cover what the primary technology site-to-site gateway is. This enables you to create a site-to-site VPN between your Windows Azure virtual network, which then contains virtual machines, and your on-premise infrastructure. So I now have IP traffic, TCP or UDP, flowing between my on-prem and my Windows Azure. I can also define DNS configuration within Windows Azure to point to my domain controllers running on-premise. If this isn't a good solution, there's also ExpressRoute. So ExpressRoute enables you to either connect your on-premise via Fiber Channel to an ExpressRoute provider, an internet exchange point, which then has a fiber connection to Windows Azure, or if you're using an MPLS technology such as AT&T's AVPN, Windows Azure can actually become an extension of your MPLS network. So this is how you can get the connectivity between your on-premise and Windows Azure. And once that IP connectivity is established, it's then a fairly simple matter to point the DNS configuration of the virtual machines to your on-premise domain controllers. In short, Azure is a separate Active Directory site in your Active Directory. If I go ahead and look at domain controllers, I have two sites. I have a Dallas site and I have a Windows Azure site because I have domain controllers both on-prem and I have it in the cloud. But even if I didn't have domain controllers in Azure, I still want to define a separate site for Windows Azure so then I can control which domain controllers would service those Windows Azure services. So I have a separate site defined in AD, and then I associate the subnet I use in Windows Azure with that site. So essentially, Windows Azure has just become an extension of my on-prem data center. This is very important, especially if I do place domain controllers in Windows Azure. I want to make sure my replication topology is accurate, and that's generated based on your site and your site link. So make sure your site link between on-prem and Azure is also costed correctly. Once the DNS configuration of your virtual network points to your domain controllers, be it on-prem or in Windows Azure, I can then just join services as normal. There's really no special steps required. They'll be able to find the domain controllers via DNS. They'll be able to communicate via just IP routing between on-prem to Windows Azure, and then they're just members of the domain. So it's actually fairly simple to extend your Active Directory out into Windows Azure.